Este verano, no te olvides de tu inglés.
You're listening to Vaughan Radio.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Western Civilization. From Mesopotamia to Silicon Valley. I'm your host, my name is Guy Williams, and you are listening to Vaughan Radio. Now, on the program tonight, I am going to talk about the theory of evolution. Evolution based on natural selection. Now, is this the creation of Charles Darwin, or did he have some kind of help, or were things happening in parallel? Well, we have to talk about Alfred Russel Wallace. You assume that the theory of evolution by natural selection, because evolution, the idea of evolution, it had been there before. It was sort of incompatible with the Platonic way of thinking, but everybody understood that things change and the form of animals can change. Now, Darwin made his observations aboard the HMS, right, His Majesty's ship, HMS Beagle, on his trip from 1831 to 1836. This voyage of discovery, had been commissioned in order to chart the coasts, right, to put the coast on a map in these southern regions of South America. All of this, as I say, the result of the idea of the independence of South America, the fact that it was no longer part of the Spanish Empire, except, of course, for Cuba and Puerto Rico, and the idea that there was a lot of money to be made. And these newly independent countries needed new allies, new partners. There was business to be done. And you can do nothing without good information. Good information requires accurate maps. And so it was very easy to get the financing for this. The ship sailed down along the southern regions of South America, and when its mission was completed, it sailed north. It put in the Galapagos Islands, and then crossed the Pacific. It stopped in Tahiti, which is how we say Tahiti. We don't call it Tahiti, we call it Tahiti, right, in Polynesia. And then finally Micronesia, Australia, before returning to England. They had gone around around Cape Horn, right, to go into the Pacific, and they returned around the Cape of Good Hope to go from the Indian Ocean back to the Atlantic and home. Okay, Cabo de Buena Esperanza, Cape of Good Hope. And of course there you will find La Ciudad del Cabo, Cape Town in what is today South Africa. Now, Darwin's masterpiece was not the first, nor the best. It was not particularly lucid. A younger, not a friend, but somebody he knew, an acquaintance of Darwin's, a man named Alfred Russel Wallace, had written something very similar and had expressed it better. Wallace was from Wales. His mother was English, his father Scottish, but he was born and raised in Wales. Now, he came into money and was able to finance his own field work as a naturalist. He was able to put all of that money to good use, traveling around the Amazon River Basin, Amazonia, in, from 1848 to 1852. And he decided to complete that with a trip to the Malay archipelago in 1854. He wrote an essay on the island of Ternate in 1858 called "On the Tendency of Varieties to Depart Indefinitely from the Original Type." Okay, I said that this was a better expression than Darwin's. Darwin's "On the Origin of Species." Now that's genius. But yeah, on the tendency of varieties to depart indefinitely from the original type. Okay. It is anything but eloquent. On the other hand, it was the first. Now, Darwin was a religious man, and he was very upset, very, very upset with the intellectual sort of conclusions that you have to come to from an idea of natural selection. Just as Newton, earlier in the century, he'd been Newton had been astonished by his own ideas of physics, specifically gravitation. And this meant that the spheres of the universe, they were not, of course, spheres at all, that the planets orbited in ellipses, and all of this, with the theory of gravitation and luminosity and other things, Newton had eliminated the need for a prime mover, eliminated the need for God in the physical universe. And he was horrified by his own ideas. Newton spent the entire second half of his life in this sort of esoteric quest, an idea, un empeño, a quest to prove that God can be present in those equations. One of his ideas was, and he spent years and years, and the man was a genius, spent all of his time and energy trying to prove that gravity, gravitational attraction, is actually a manifestation of God's love. So, he was unable to do this, and when he did, he was actually unable to convince himself, and certainly not other people. So the Newton we remember is the one who removed God from the equation for the physical universe. And Darwin a very religious man, Darwin was very much afraid that natural selection was going to eliminate God from biology, including the implications that human beings had evolved from something presumably more primitive. In any case, Wallace and Darwin both had come across Malthus's essay on the principle of population. This is where we get the adjective Malthusian. Thomas Malthus, talking about populations, how they can rise and fall based on, the supply of food, basically. When food is abundant, populations rise. But obviously there's some sort of cyclical time when food is not abundant, and at that point, people die. The level of population falls. And we call this Malthusian, the idea that at one point there will not be enough food, or that the harvest will not come in, that the whole system will collapse, and that will cause a massive decline in population among human beings. This is what we call Malthusian. Now, Wallace and Darwin were very, very impressed by this essay on the principles of population. And in 1839, Darwin had also published, in a sort of confusing way, Journal and Remarks, a summary of observations, anthropological, geological, and biological observations that he made from the voyage on the Beagle. And obviously both men were extremely impressed by the great leaps, the breakthroughs in the science of geology. At the time, there were people like Charles Lyell who had established, to the satisfaction of the scientific community, the idea that the Earth was much, much older than, for example, the Bible says. And, geology, botany, all of these things were, science was really consolidating rapidly in the 19th century. So, Wallace, in his isolation there in the Malay Peninsula, Wallace put this all down in his essay in 1858, discussing processes that affect population and the difference between wild animals and domesticated animals. Ideas, well, the thing is that, the idea of survival of the fittest, right? Supervivencia de los más aptos. This is a phrase from the philosopher Herbert Spencer that comes much later. This idea of adapting Darwinism to human society, all of that comes much, much later. But the fact is that it begins with Wallace. Wallace explicitly says that, talking about insects, he says, the insects that have colors best adapted to concealment, right, esconderse, concealment from the enemy, will inevitably survive the longest. A sort of revelation for the people who read it, things we now regard as normal. For example, the fact that the relationship of predator and prey, presa, predator and prey, are going to be sort of in a fixed relationship, a proportional relationship, but this is naturally unstable. There will be cycles. Now, he talks about, he says, I quote, "We could become perfectly acquainted with the organization and habits of various species of animals, and we could measure the capacity of each animal for performing the acts necessary to its safety and existence under all the varying circumstances by which it is surrounded. We might even be able to calculate the proportionate abundance of individuals, which is the necessary result." Okay, this is very 19th century, but what he's talking about is the possibility of going out and discovering an ecosystem, right? We use the word ecologist quite often to talk about somebody who is very passionate about environmental preservation, right? El medio ambiente, the environment, environmental protection and sustainability and all of that. We call these people ecologists and things that are eco-friendly, but the genuine ecologist is the person out there modeling an ecosystem. Flows of energy, sunlight adapted by photosynthesis, for example, nutrients, interactions, all of that can be expressed in quantitative terms. It can be put into a model and analyzed. And Wallace was the first to see this. And so, yeah, obvious to us, but a revelation back then. Now, Wallace sent his essay to Darwin, and Darwin's reaction was, uh-oh. Because Darwin knew that he had come to the same conclusions much earlier. And so it was going to be very, very difficult. I mean, his reputation was at stake. Darwin, as I say, horrified by the implications of evolution by natural selection. How that simply, not just the Bible, the literal meaning of the Bible, but so many other things are thrown out the window. Perhaps the existence of God is simply thrown out the window if you take natural selection seriously. So yeah, horrified. One of the reasons he sat on his papers until Wallace's ideas were about to go public. So what to do? Well, there was a sort of panic, a sort of confusion, and Darwin gave copies of some of what he had written to the geologist, to Lyell, the one talking about the antiquity of the Earth, how very, very old the Earth is, and to a botanist another genius, a man named Joseph Hooker. He gave his writings and Wallace's writings to them, and Wallace didn't know. But there was a public reading of Darwin and Wallace's writings in front of one of the scientific societies in London in 1858. And, they decided to allow Wallace, who was actually very, very open to this, very, very good-natured about it. They allowed, and of course, Wallace ultimately benefited from this because they allowed Wallace to publish his article first. Now, believe it or not, this reading was not a revelation. Or at least it was a revelation, but not treated as such because people, perhaps because they didn't understand the implications of what they had heard. But in this society, the Linnean Society of London, this scientific club, there really wasn't a lot of interest. Certainly not strong interest, and dismissal, skepticism. Obviously, people missed its meaning. They just didn't connect. They didn't understand. They didn't think it through. So, yes, Darwin needed to do something more. Obviously, he had taken copious notes in those 5 years of voyage. And so it was going to be essential for him to condense those notes into evidence, incontrovertible evidence. He was going to have to prove to these people exactly what he and Wallace had independently discovered. And so, after sitting on it for decades, he worked like a demon just to get it ready for publication. And it was out the following year. On the Origin of Species, which, for marketing purposes, that is the best title he could have come up with. On the Origin of Species. The initial printing was 1,250 copies. And when it came out, that was the bomb. It generated a tremendous controversy. And people who had not read it, people who had just heard condensed versions or rumors of what it said or what it implied. I would never read anything like that. I don't have to. Yes, this controversy. Wallace was lost. He had been first, but Darwin, on the Origin of Species, Darwin is the one who takes the historical position because Darwin generated the controversy. Wallace and Darwin were not entirely on the same page.